good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are based in. On behalf of iGST Adaptation Working Group, I welcome you all to attend this webinar to launch a new publication, Perspectives, Adequacy and Effectiveness of Adaptation in the Global Stocktake. So my name is Jingjing Gao, and I am a researcher at UNEP Copenhagen Climate Center. I work in the field of climate risk assessment, adaptation transparency, and climate resilience building. So I also act as the co-chair of this adaptation working group and the co-editor of this new publication. So the working group of the iGST was created in 2019 to support the GST, and this year the working group's program is co-chaired by UNEP, Copenhagen Climate Center, and the India Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. An introduction on the working group and iGST will be given to you by my colleague later. Today, we will present this new publication, which was published earlier this week. A download link will be shared with you in the chat box shortly. So now I would like to introduce you to today's agenda. In the first segment, my co-editor, Lars Christensen, will give us an overview of the publication and a brief introduction on the 6 papers included here. And then in the second segment, we will have a panel discussion with our contributing authors. During this session, we will have the opportunity to further understand the perspectives that our authors bring in. Finally, we will open the floor for questions, comments, and discussion to interact with our panelists, including our contributing authors and editors. Before we start, please be aware that this webinar will be recorded. If you have questions or comments during the presentation and the panel discussion, please use the question mark function to leave your question or comments there. We will have a chance to discuss them during the Q&A session. With that, I'd like to invite Lars Christensen to present this publication. Lars has more than 50 years of experience of adaptation, focusing on financing and implementation project and transparency-related work. He's also a scientific editor and the leading author for the UNEP Adaptation Gap Report. Lars, welcome.
Thank you, Jingjing. Okay, hello, good morning, day everyone. As mentioned in this presentation, I will be giving you a quick snapshot of the work done in the Adaptation Working Group of the iGST over this past year. The work is published today in a new report entitled Adequacy and Effectiveness of Adaptation in the Global Stocktake. As mentioned, my name is Lars Christensen, and I'm the co-lead editor of the report together with my colleague Jingjing Gao that you were just seeing before. So to quickly introduce the context of our work, just a couple of quick words on the global stocktake and how it will function for adaptation. The Paris Agreement established for the first time since the creation of the Global Climate Convention a global goal on adaptation, which sounds enhancing adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience and reducing vulnerability to climate change, with a view to contributing to sustainable development and ensuring an adequate adaptation response in the context of the temperature goal. At the same time, the Paris Agreement also established a process to monitor global progress towards the so-called long-term goals of the Paris Agreement, including this global goal on adaptation. This process, the so-called global stocktake, is to be conducted every 5 years, starting in 2023, so this year. Specifically for adaptation, the global stocktake established 4 basic functions to be achieved: recognizing adaptation efforts of developing country parties, enhancing the implementation of adaptation action, taking into account the adaptation communication, reviewing the adequacy and effectiveness of adaptation and the support provided for adaptation, and reviewing the overall progress made in achieving the global goal on adaptation. In other words, it's clear what the general goals of global adaptation are, and also what progress is to be monitored and when. However, as is often the case, the devil is in the detail, and with many persistent unresolved methodological issues, how to translate such ambitions into a meaningful assessment of global adaptation progress remains a major challenge, even as we are now approaching the conclusion of this first global stocktake. In response to these challenges, the Independent Global Stocktake, or iGST initiative, was established in 2018 as a consortium of civil society actors working together to support a more robust and inclusive global stocktake. The iGST consists of 4 working groups: adaptation, mitigation, finance, and equity, and 3 cross-cutting regional hubs: Latin America, West Africa, and South Asia, as you can see in this schematic. The Adaptation Working Group has been active throughout this period and have produced a number of products and papers targeting the global stocktake for adaptation. Looking at the most pressing issues and challenges facing the global stocktake, the Adaptation Working Group of the iGST decided to focus on the third function of the global stocktake for adaptation. That is, how can the global stocktake in a meaningful way review the adequacy and effectiveness of adaptation and the support provided for adaptation. This is a challenging issue given the low degree of methodological clarity, including on an operational definition of the global goal and adaptation, as well as the terms adequate adaptation and effective adaptation, and the general lack of consensus on adaptation metrics. This reality was also reflected in the recent synthesis report for the technical assessment component of the first global stocktake, which was prepared by the UNFCCC Secretariat last year. We set up a basic working question: how can the concepts of adequacy and effectiveness of adaptation be operationalized in assessment of global progress on adaptation? The ambition has not been to completely resolve this question, but rather to advance conceptual and operational discussions around that question, which will ultimately help strengthen and advance the global stocktake itself. Our approach is one of perspective, which that is, we have invited a range of leading experts and practitioners, asking them to respond to the working question, adding their personal ideas and perspectives based on their unique knowledge and experience. This edition assembles 6 unique contributions and an editorial from a total of 12 authors, each responding from their own perspective to the working question included on the last slide. This approach writes itself into a long-standing tradition and series here at UNEP Copenhagen Climate Center called Perspectives, some of which you can see in this slide. This slide gives just a general overview of the framework we apply in the publication. Assessment of adequacy and effectiveness straddles the science policy interface, and all papers therefore address to varying degrees both aspects. That is, how adequacy and effectiveness are conceptually defined and how they can be practically operationalized in a policy context. Furthermore, a few papers discuss emerging empirical practice. I'll now just give you a very short overview of the papers, including in the publication, hoping that will spark your interest and encourage you to download our report and to read the papers yourself. Obviously, I can only provide a teaser for the really rich contents included in the individual papers, so apologies in advance for not doing full justice. The first paper is by Corina von Teichmann-Utesch, who is a consultant and former UNFCCC staff member, closely engaged in the work of a number of constituent bodies. In her paper, Corina provides a historic overview of how the concept of adequacy and effectiveness have developed and been interpreted in the UNFCCC. That is, in terms of both political decisions, party submissions and opinions, as well as technical guidance and input from various UNFCCC stakeholders. The paper concludes that in spite of more than 2 decades of technical work and political discussions, operational methodologies and definitions of adequacy and effectiveness remains unclear, underlining the gap that this publication is trying to address. She points to a need for the global stocktake to work at multiple scales in parallel to achieve dual objectives of providing a global overview of the adequacy and effectiveness of adaptation efforts, while also facilitating learning. This could be, for example, a combination of globally applicable review criteria tracked across countries, complemented by context-specific self-assessments of the adequacy and effectiveness of adaptation and support. The next paper by Susanna Fisher from King's College London and University College London takes a step back to discuss some more fundamental questions that will need to be clarified before the concepts of adequacy and effectiveness of adaptation can be meaningfully applied in a global assessment such as the global stocktake. It discusses how perspective matters in how the concepts of adequacy and effectiveness are understood and implemented, and ultimately how it makes sense and for whom. The key question, therefore, is adequate and effective for whom, when, and why. These are questions we need to collectively agree on before we can even begin to design a meaningful framework for assessing progress. The paper points out that any framework for assessment of adequacy and effectiveness of adaptation should look beyond its immediate objectives of stocktaking and take into consideration how the measurement of results can provide a meaningful feedback to a country's adaptation practice and eventually facilitate better adaptation actions. Our next paper by Gigi Owen at the University of Arizona presents a literature review of 110 case studies where inputs, processes, outputs, and outcomes have been characterized as effective. It proposes a coding and assessment system for these case studies, which provides an instructive example of how highly heterogeneous data sets on effectiveness can be meaningfully assessed on an aggregated level at a global level. Based on this experience, it proposes a prototype model for how the global stocktake could potentially be based on a similar framework as the one used for the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. It proposes how this could be done by subdividing the still vaguely defined global goal on adaptation into a larger number of more tangible sub-goals organized by climate impact, geographical location, categories of adaptation action, etc. Each with its own targets and indicators of the effectiveness of inputs, processes, outputs, and outcomes. The fourth paper by Emily Bouchon from the International Institute for Sustainable Development and Binyam Ghebreyesus from the International Institute for Environment and Development presents an overview of challenges and opportunities involved in assessing adequacy and effectiveness for adaptation. In particular, it discusses the challenge of how to balance the needs of an aggregated global assessment, like the global stocktake, with the needs of national monitoring, evaluation, and learning systems. It goes on to suggest that a productive and meaningful global stocktake must ultimately be country-driven and therefore should be designed in a way capable of accommodating a diversity of metrics rather than narrowing down specific methodological or conceptual pathways. It further suggests that national monitoring, evaluation, and learning systems are in fact ideally placed to bridge the gap between the global stocktake's need for relatively simple global conclusions and complex local realities that cannot easily be aggregated. In the view of the authors, the global stocktake should embrace this as an opportunity to actively support and promote national systems and the learning opportunities they represent, rather than confining them through a set of predetermined metrics. The paper by Alexandre Magnan, Ariadna Anisimov, and Lola Melejo from IRRI presents an adaptation assessment tool under development, the so-called gap track, and shares early experiences from implementation at both national and global scales. In short, the tool is based on qualitative expert judgment through simple scoring rather than aggregation of data from the bottom up, thereby avoiding the most thorny methodological issues involved in assessing adaptation. It consists of 6 overarching aspects of adaptation: knowledge, planning, actions, capacities, evidence and forecasting, and 19 sub-questions, each of which are scored through expert judgment in a highly structured process. The gap track is a great example of independent work outside of the formal UNFCCC process that are testing new approaches and workarounds of current methodological issues faced in conducting global level assessment of adaptation progress. Work which could ultimately inspire and feed into an improved global stocktake for adaptation, including on adequacy and effectiveness. The final paper in our volume is based on work conducted by our co-leads in the Adaptation Working Group, the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. It has reviewed all available adaptation communications and national adaptation plans, including a deep dive on a couple of case studies in West Africa. It finds that only a few countries have actually included adequacy and effectiveness related information, and those that do generally include very limited information on the specific methodology used. It seems increasingly clear, therefore, that UNFCCC country submissions will not provide any solutions to the challenge of conducting a global stocktake for adequacy and effectiveness. At least in the context of the first global stocktake, documentation such as adaptation communications will not contain data to support meaningful global aggregation in either quantitative or qualitative terms. This underlines the call in this publication for needing other solutions for operationalizing the global stocktake's assessment of adequacy and effectiveness. And finally, just to summarize a few overarching headlines from across the papers presented in this volume. First of all, the papers all demonstrate the need to move beyond the rather generic headlines of COP decisions and towards more practical questions of how to conduct the global stocktake in practice. What does adequacy and effectiveness actually mean in practice? And could it mean different things to different people? And who is the global stocktake for? And what is it actually trying to achieve? And how can our operational approach assure that the global stocktake becomes a meaningful and impactful exercise for everyone and at all levels? Our papers all have different yet converging, I would say, ideas on how these questions, and thus will help the global discussion move forward in this year of the first global stocktake. Second, all papers seem to suggest that the global stocktake will need to carefully balance multiple objectives in one integrated process. The ideal framework for assessment of adequacy and effectiveness may not, therefore, need to choose between quantitative or qualitative approaches, nor will it need to function either top-down or bottom-up. Rather, it may need to think outside of the box and provide solutions capable of containing both and balancing their pros and cons. And I think with that very short introduction, I'll head it back. I would like to say thank you and head back to you, Jinjing. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Lars, for walking us through this publication. Okay, so next, to deepen our understanding on the perspectives that is included in this publication, I'd like to start today's panel discussion. Let me first introduce our panelists. We have the honor to have our contributing authors here sitting with us today. May I please ask our panel members to activate your cameras, please? Thank you very much. And let me introduce them to you. First, we have Vidi Avishia, who is currently a postdoctoral researcher at the India Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, India. Vidi is also the co-chair of this iGST Adaptation Working Group. Her research ranges from adaptation policies and interactions in urban spaces to mitigation and GHG inventory. Welcome, Vidi. And then we have Emily Bichon, who is the lead on monitoring, evaluation, and learning at iISD. Emily has 15 years of experience in MEL and sustainability policy. She is also the co-chair of the Risk to Resilience Methodological Advisory Group, and she sits on the trial advice panel of the UK Cabinet Office. Welcome, Emily. Our next panel member is Susanna Fisher, who is a senior research fellow at the University of College London and leads a major program assessing the role of measurement in adapting to climate change. Susanna has over 50 years of experience working as a researcher, advisor, and a practitioner. Welcome, Susanna. Our next panel member is Alexandra McNann, who is a senior researcher at IDDRI. His research included developing expert judgment methods to assess climate risks and adaptation efforts across scales. He's also an author for IPCC report and the UNEP Adaptation Gap Report. He's a member of the World Adaptation Science Program's Scientific Committee. Welcome you, Alex. Last but not least, we have Corina von Tachman-Ettesch, Sorry. Corina is a former UFCCC staff, and she's now working as a consultant for UFCCC. She's currently leading the work on adequacy and the effectiveness of adaptation and support within the Adaptation Committee. And she has previously been involved in other work in UFCCC as well. Welcome you, Corina. Beyond these 5 authors sitting with us today, we also have another contributing author who could not join us today due to time zone difficulty. So please also allow me to introduce her to you. Gigi Owen is a social scientist at the University of Arizona. Her research is in the field of adaptation actions, assessment on global scale, as well as focusing on local and regional climate action in the US Southwest related to small-scale agriculture, water availability, and community-based adaptation initiatives. It's just such a regret that we could not have her today. Okay, that's all our panelists today. Thank you for your great contribution to this publication. Welcome to the panel discussion. So to start, as introduced by Lars, this publication explores 2 dimensions of the understanding of adequacy and effectiveness as a 2 concepts. Let's have a closer look at the conceptualization aspect. So adequacy and effectiveness are not new concepts in the UFCCC context, but how the understanding of those 2 concepts have been developed a long time, especially post the Paris Agreement, where the GST was established. And what does this development, especially the recent discussion, advance the understanding of those 2 concepts under GST? So for that, I'd like to invite Corina to share her insight on this point with her capacity of leading the work of adequacy and effectiveness of adaptation and support within the Adaptation Committee. Please, Corina.
Thanks very much, Jing Jing. And before I start answering your question, I would also like to extend a very warm welcome to everyone. It's very good to see that quite a few people are interested in this quite complex topic. And I think we're all looking forward to the subsequent discussion. Maybe also some participants of the audience will have good ideas and maybe also already some experience that they can bring to this discussion. So I'm very much looking forward. So on your question, Jing Jing, how these 2 concepts have been approached under the convention to date, how their understanding has developed. Indeed, as you were saying, these 2 concepts are not new. They have already been part of the original convention text, also in relation to adaptation. But as you all will be aware, in the early days of the convention, adaptation did not play a major role. The focus was on mitigation. And so these 2 concepts were never really defined under the convention and not even discussed. And what the COP did in the early days to learn something about how adequate and effective adaptation really was, it invited parties to report on what they were doing on adaptation, the actions that they implemented, and how effective they were. But when the COP received the first reports, it had to realize that actually not a lot of adaptation, implementation, action was going on. And parties actually reported that they were facing a lot of challenges already with the assessments of the impact and of vulnerabilities and of risks. And they were at that time not implementing a lot of adaptation. And so the COP was not able to assess whether progress was being made towards the adaptation-related objectives of the convention. And so what it did then was to set up over the years a lot of different processes and institutional arrangements in order to help countries, particularly developing countries, in doing these assessments, and then later on also in doing adaptation planning and implementation. And these different processes and institutional arrangements that were set up, they came up with quite a few guidance material and tools. And through these tools and guidance, some more indirect approaches to effective and adequate adaptation were provided. So there was still not an open discussion on the two terms, but indirectly these bodies and processes and tools that were set up gave some indication on how effective adaptation could be understood. In terms of adaptation support, the picture looks slightly different. As you all know, support gets more attention. And so for adaptation support, we have three types, three means of implementation, which are also there to support mitigation activities, which is finance, technology, development and transfer, and capacity building. And for these three means of implementation, mechanisms have been set up over the years in order to support mitigation and adaptation. And also review mechanisms have been set up to review the support that was being provided for adaptation and mitigation. And so these review mechanisms have undertaken quite a few reviews over the years of the support, and they have also considered how adequate and effective this support has been. And through these subsequent reviews, there are actually quite a few lessons that can be learned. They have adjusted these review mechanisms over time, the methods, also the indicators, the review areas that were being used. And so there are actually quite a few lessons that can be learned, and there has been more discussions and also experts that have been involved in order to come up with these methodologies and with the review criteria. So what is then the difference between before and after the establishment of the Paris Agreement? As I said before, or in the early days of the convention, attention to adaptation was not very high. But already in the run-up to the Paris Agreement, this obviously changed because adaptation was gaining much more importance. It was clear that mitigation goals and objectives were not really being met, and climate impacts became more obvious. And so developing countries in the run-up to the Paris Agreement asked whether their adaptation actions, but also the support that they were receiving, was actually adequate, was actually sufficient. And on the other hand, the developed countries then asked, well, of course, that is a very valid concern and question. But before talking maybe about more support, we want to look at whether the support that we are currently providing and that you're using to implement adaptation, whether that is actually effective in the first place before we look into more support. So this is basically how the two concepts ended up in the Paris Agreement and are now part of the global stocktake and need to be reviewed every 5 years. So here we are, and it's a difficult undertaking. But so the attention since the Paris Agreement to these two concepts has gained in importance. They have gained much more attention, and actually discussions have taken place. And the first thing that the COP did was to mandate the Adaptation Committee and the Least Developed Countries Expert Group and the Standing Committee on Finance to develop methodologies to review the adequacy and effectiveness of adaptation. And in the first years, they were unable to come up with a perfect solution. They confessed that there were a lot of challenges attached to this, and knowledge was not sufficient. And so they were then mandated to keep compiling existing methodologies, which would be relevant. And this is what they did, and they extracted lessons learned and further ideas and experiences, and also developed some framings which could be used to approach this review. And also the two concepts were then discussed in other related fora, for example, under the work program on the global goal on adaptation, but also, of course, within the technical dialogues of the global stocktake. So I think this is the biggest difference, that it has received now the attention that it probably deserves, and a lot of discussions have taken place. And we will see whether also now in the last months of the global stocktake, there will be some more structured approach to it. But I think this has already been a value in itself, to bring to the table a lot of different perspectives and understandings of the concepts, and also that it has been pointed, a lot of people have pointed to the challenges that are attached. And I think we will hear from my fellow co-authors on what their experience is and their ideas on how to move this forward. Thanks, Jing. Back to you.
Thank you, Corinna, very much for your insight, and that provides us an overview of how the two concepts have been developed in the last decades, and great to know that various work streams are taking effort around this topic. So to be meaningfully moving those ongoing efforts forward, and one key question is what are the key elements to take into consideration for us in conceptualizing the adequacy and effectiveness of adaptation. So for that, I'd like to ask Susanna to share her insight with us based on her years research experience of measuring adaptation actions. Please, Susanna.
Thanks, Jing, and thanks, Corinna, for that really interesting kind of summary of where we are. So I think my paper and the kind of intervention I wanted to make today is to maybe take a step back from lots of the very detailed and important technical work and compilations that have gone on, led by the Secretariat and others, which, as kind of we've heard from the summary from Lars, has produced an amazing amount of approaches, ideas, frameworks, tools, indicators, so much so that there's almost we're kind of a little lost, is my feeling, in the amount of technical detail and possibilities that exist. So I wanted to kind of make an intervention around some questions that we might ask ourselves, therefore, about how most usefully to use all this information and what the kind of strategic purpose of the stocktake in this first one and going forward could be. So I think the first point I wanted to make, which we've heard a little bit of already, is how much these concepts are sitting at the kind of heart of the science and policy interface. And perhaps some of the challenges that we have is asking ourselves what part of these questions are kind of scientific and technical, where we'll reach certainty, and what part of these questions are actually political, because embedded within the ideas of adequacy and effectiveness are the ideas about what do we value, what are our priorities, what does the future look like for this country, for the global community, for different different individuals and households. So within those ideas and concepts are many, many different framings of how people see their future. So I think that's my first kind of point, is that as many authors actually have picked up in their papers, so it's great to actually see this convergence, that there are multiple ways of understanding these concepts, and the stocktake really has to acknowledge, I think, and build on that multiplicity. So that leads me to my second point, which is I think that in this first instance of the stocktake, maybe one of the most useful things to do is to be really explicit about those different framings. There are different ways of understanding the concept. There's different knowledge in the stocktake process. There's such a diversity. So instead of perhaps looking for a unified output, maybe what we're going to see is a way of mapping all these insights to identify the major gaps and challenges. If coming out of this first stocktake, we have idea of whose knowledge is missing, what types of adaptation is missing, where do we see things aren't working, or the major blockages that could lead us towards making progress. Maybe that could be the most useful thing we could have out of this first process. And that leads me on to my third point, which is thinking about how the stocktake itself also shapes action and how it can be used for its second kind of purpose around supporting learning and improving adaptation ambition within countries. So I think going forward, thinking about these outputs, the consideration of outputs phase that's coming up next, and how the overall assessment is framed, I think it's really important to consider beyond the report, what will this do for countries? What will this do for communities and households that enable the adaptation, ambition, and implementation to be raised? And so I really think that's a really key thing to try and keep in mind, is how can we design this for ambition beyond an evaluation, of which there are a number of kind of global synthesis pieces of work out there. And this piece has a very different purpose because it is so integrated within that political fora. And I think that leads me to the last point I wanted to make in this opening intervention, which is about thinking about the future within adequacy and effectiveness, and that the future that we're working toward is not necessarily fixed. We've got a changing risk environment, but also there are changing aspirations for countries. Future is also a kind of contested terrain of where does a country want to go. And so I think it's important to keep in mind within the stocktake that it's always going to be a moving target. There's not going to be a finished point. And we need to be very kind of clear about how the idea of the future is contained within the concept, and how we also allow kind of more ambitious ideas of a climate change future to be incorporated within the stocktake. And I think I'll leave it there to allow others.
Thank you very much, Susanna, for sharing that with us. Indeed, GST for the first time, we all believe that it will be a learning by doing process. And all those principles that you mentioned in your discussion, that I believe that it's not only, applies for assessment, so on project level, but also this also applies for GST at the global level. And without clearly defined goals, as you mentioned to your last point, so the goals are changing, developing without clearly defined goals and the boundaries, operationalizing the assessment of adequacy and effectiveness could be very challenging. And speaking of operationalization, one of the largest challenge is how the GST could assess the adequacy and effectiveness of adaptation at a global level, at the meantime being meaningful for the most vulnerable at the local level. Let me turn this discussion to Emily. Emily, based on your research experience in monitoring, evaluation, and learning system, so in your view, how can the countries contribute to address this challenge, and through what mechanisms or process? Please, Emily.
Thank you, Jingjing, and thanks to Jingjing and Lars for coordinating all this work, and to all the coordinators for the work. And it's great to see people here today. It's great to also follow up on Susanna and build on the idea of multiplicity, because the paper of my co-author Binyam Jibrayas and I really aim to focus at keeping this multiplicity of methods, so that we can focus on what countries need to enhance adaptation action. Because really, under the GST as an international exercise led by the UNFCCC, it simply cannot do it all and get a comprehensive understanding of all the relevant local data. So when you deal with multiple scales at which to get data, especially with adaptation being so contextualized, you also need multiple scales for operationalizing the assessments and for analyzing the data. It can't be just a one-set exercise. And while there are methodological questions in how to link the data, how to compile, etc., what we wanted to emphasize was there is also, and perhaps mostly, a question of how to govern the evidence. So it's great to have robust methods, but who and how are we going to implement it and implement them? So who is this we? And our paper proposes to redefine some of the issues in assessing adequacy and effectiveness under the GST, but also to redefine some of the other exercises in linking local to global assessments, like the global goal on adaptation, to not just focus, or to not solely focus on indicators and methods, but also to think about how different systems of evidence work together. And this is where national monitoring, evaluation, and learning systems come into play. In our paper, we outline 3 key roles for national MEL systems. There are more than that, of course. I'll mention them here briefly, but I'll have a chance to get into it a bit later. And the first one is to provide a platform for accessing data and insights. So national MEL systems already compile, synthesize, aggregate various data for different reporting and policy purposes, including other global reporting processes. So data from national MEL systems already represent a quite varied source of data, including devolved data. And here I think it's important for me to do a little caveat that when I say national MEL systems, it also includes the devolved systems that they include, for example, local governments, regional governments, etc. So it's not just the national layer, it's the national and the layers that they include below. So it's important to look at them already as a source. The other key role is to capture stories and outcome from local voices, because really not all the disaggregated data from local assessments can be condensed or aggregated into a global level. So national MEL systems already serve as a way to create meta-narratives on what is the adaptation stories that are going on out there, and what are the key priorities and the top hotspots for vulnerability in the country. And last, it's really, MEL systems are really key to ensure mutual accountability and learning. So the GST is designed as a ratcheting mechanism to increase ambition. And that means that the GST outputs should consider how to best disseminate back and feedback its results to those who are making decisions about adaptation. So we need to design this ambition, as Susanna mentioned. And with the localized nature of adaptation, that means that the information needs to be fed back into these national systems so that people who are making daily decisions about adaptation can use this evidence. So, of course, under this redefinition of rules, international guidance is very important to shine a light on key areas to drive joint efforts. So it's not just a bottom-up, it's really a joining exercise so that we can address global issues without overburdening countries. So, for example, a non-prescriptive framework, an example can give directions and can help countries strengthen their national mail systems. It's also important to note that focusing on mail systems is not exclusionary, it's not exclusive, it's not the only solution. In fact, it actually points to the importance of having a plurality of methods and embracing a plurality of methods that can capture the multidimensional aspects of adequacy and effectiveness. So there's no problem for combining other methods and approaches that, for example, co-presenters are talking about today. And some that are implementable now for the first GST, and some that perhaps we can look forward in future GST cycles, because over the years we can build on complexity. But reinforcing mail systems in any situation is really essential to reaching local views and getting representative data for the GST, but also, for example, for the GGA and other international agreements. I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you, Emily. Indeed, a GST involves a great numbers of stakeholders' effort, and the countries play a key role here to link the GST's assessment on global level, and also the adaptation practice. In reality, they are all happening at local level. But then the next question would be, so what is the current status of countries' practice in reporting and communicating those adaptation efforts? Let me invite our iGST Adaptation Working Group co-chair, Vidi from IIMN, who has carried out an empirical study on the country's reporting data to share some of her findings. Vidi, based on the data that you have collected and analyzed in your discussion paper, what is your impression about if the country reporting can support assessment of adequacy and effectiveness of adaptation on the GST? And what are the challenges for country reporting and how to address those challenges by the future GSTs? Please, Vidi.
Yeah, thanks, Jingjing, and good day, everyone. My observations, a lot of them are not very different from some of the co-authors to this perspective, but when we started with this question as to what are the countries doing and how are they trying to frame or understand the idea of and convey it to the UNFCCC, the idea of adequacy and effectiveness, we took the cognizance of the Adaptation Committee LEG report and the methods and the challenges that they listed out, and then started looking at all the submissions that have come to UNFCCC, the NAP, as well as the ADCOMs. We've started with the NAPs, and we looked at the reporting guidelines of the NAPs and what's going in the NAPs, and trying to compare and see how the documents look like. And we did realize that there is a huge variation in what gets conveyed. So to start with, to give you an example, the NAP of Cambodia that was submitted in 2021 is actually their 2013 document, which was 2014 to 2023 plan. So there's a huge time gap into what UNFCCC has information about versus what might have actually happened in the country further, because the document talks about establishing an MEL system, etc. But then we don't know what MEL system has already come up, and officially we don't know, right? Because it's not being passed on to UNFCCC. Again, NAP document is the only document that actually wants countries to submit their MEL systems or discuss monitoring and evaluation as such. If you look at the ADCOM guidelines, they don't require the countries to kind of put forth what are their plans for M&E. Also, then there are other ways some countries have tackled. For example, if you look at the document that Brazil submitted, they clearly upfront put up a statement saying, for them, effective adaptation implies that the strategy to be developed must integrate the approach of risk management into current public sector planning, policy making, etc. Further, so that's the way they're treating effectiveness, right? Further, there are several documents that actually don't mention anything on adequacy or effectiveness as such, or the support of adequacy, the adequacy of support as such. And then there are some that actually have mentioned bottom-up approaches, like like Italy's document says co-designing of MEL systems, or Australia's document talks about both its domestic as well as international efforts. So kind of the funding that they provide to other countries, and their participatory approach of evaluating those efforts. But then again, those they do mention participatory approach and the framework, but then they don't get into details of what indicators they're looking at, or what indices or parameters they're looking into, etc., or how, or what kind of progress these support, local as well as in domestic as well as international support has been. So it's a very sparse information everywhere, and we're really not sure how UNFCCC could actually start taking a cognizance for the first GST as such. If the first GST then starts giving back a message to the country saying these things need to be improved upon, it's when we can then expect the second GST onwards to have a better outcome on adequacy and effectiveness as such. Right. Also, we did notice that because there are huge time variations in what gets submitted and variations in how and it is perceived, maybe compiling could be an issue. So what we've tried to then kind of suggest is have something similar to what the tables, the 9 tables of the CTF have. They already have some portion on support, right? Adaptation related support. So just tracking them may give us an idea if the support has increased, decreased over time, but not give us much information on whether this increase has been effective or adequate. So if we could include a few more indicators there, and kind of link it also with the way the SDG M&E framework works, then it could be a better way of kind of bringing in some more objective information into assessing not just the function of adequacy and effectiveness, also the GST function of progress on GGA. So that's what we were just trying to put forth in this paper. Thanks, Jingjing, over to you.
Thank you, Vidi. It appears like countries are taking their own way in reporting and communicating their adaptation effort. And especially so the different time frame and timelines for various reporting process makes it even challenging for this practice. And it clearly says that there's a guidance in doing so is missing. So from this point, so there's still much space for GST to develop more practical guidance for the country to follow to contribute to GST's assessment in the future. However, let's look at the more brighter side. Actually, so the adaptation committee and the LEG and in collaboration with the SCF have been working on compiling existing methodologies. And it is also likely that for the first GST, it will apply a combined approach that currently are available. What can we learn from the existing tools or methods that can potentially be applied for GST in assessing the adequacy and effectiveness of adaptation? So let me invite Alex to share his experience in designing and applying a tool to assess the adaptation at aggregated scales. Please, Alex.
Yeah, thanks, Jingjing and all. Well, I think you understand when you will read the report, it will be clear too that there is an agreement that there is no silver bullet approach, which is not surprising, actually, that's life. And so we need to combine different approaches. And so the common question that is crossing the different chapters and maybe many heads that are connected today is how to do that. Because it's cool to say we need multiple visions and so on, but concretely, and some of the colleagues touched upon that, how to do that exactly. So let me give you just some thoughts and just say that I'm coming from a rather scientific and outsider perspective. So you need to consider my thoughts this way. Well, I see three main types of approaches to assessing adaptation progress, and so to discuss this adequacy and effectiveness topic. The first one is that has been mentioned the analysis of the policy documents. The UNFCCC Secretariat is doing that. The adaptation gap report also, and many others, and that's super valuable because it helps reflecting parties' own views on this topic, and that is super useful. But we understand that Vaidi and Emily especially touched on that. It remains difficult to aggregate this policy-driven information just because the information is not calibrated in the same way. But still, it is valuable because we see what countries think about adaptation and about adequacy and effectiveness, and that's useful. Another type of approach is around quantitative-based methods. Trying to identify the right indicators to describe what adaptation is, and trying to find the data to inform these indicators. The big issue we have here is that, and this is the common issue for all the methods trying to use quantitative indicators, is that first of all, this is not so easy to define what is a right indicator for adaptation. And often you come up with a list of hundreds indicators. And so that's cool, but that's also hard to manage and to play with. And the other problem is that for most of the indicators, you come up with this conclusion that you don't have the information to inform them in a quantitative way. And so often what I see, and again, I'm coming from a purely scientific perspective, what I see is that the long list of indicators is reduced drastically just to the indicators you can inform with quantitative information. And then often you come up with more or less GDP related information, which is good, interesting, useful, but it's not reflecting the whole complexity of adaptation. So we lose some information, but at the same time, it is really useful to help tracking progress, for example, over time, because you have quantitative information, different snapshots, and you can follow what the evolution of these snapshots is. And also, possibly you have the opportunity to rely on let's say, reliable data. Just because it is made of statistics and so on. So is it reliable really? I don't know, but still you have some information that you can see where the evidence are. So that's cool, but that's insufficient. And again, because we miss many very qualitative and human aspects of adaptation, such as risk perception, governance mechanisms, and so on, but useful. The other area of assessing adaptation, adequacy, and effectiveness, and this is what we try to do in the chapter, is to look at expert judgment exercise. expert judgment exercises are often criticized because of not being quantitatively based and possibly subjective, because a group of people decide where to put the cursor for this or this dimension. That's true, but you have to remind that this is a core method used in the IPCC reports, for example, and I think not so many people think that the IPCC is not doing a good job, for example, on risk assessment. So there is also value with expert judgment. One is that it's because the expert judgment is basically you ask questions. For example, this is what we do in the chapter, and for the questions you ask a group of experts to give a score. Anyway, the scale we don't care about that, but you give a score, and to inform this score you can bring in all the kind of information you want, you need. That means that you don't only rely on quantitative information and quantitative information availability, but you can also bring in the own expert experience. You can bring in some insight from traditional knowledge and this kind of thing. So it helps in a way overcome some of the problems of the previous methods. Of course, there are many limitations. I briefly touched on that, and you will see that they are described in the chapter, just to be honest. But in the end, what I see is that really, and I can't remember who talked about that, but I think it would be really useful to map the weaknesses and strengths of the different approaches and see where they complement each other, because this way probably we can come up with something that is combining multiple approaches and be sure that we use the best of each of them as much as possible. I can stop here. I don't have silver bullet solution, but as I was saying at the beginning, there is no.
Thank you, Alex. Just to clarify, I don't think anyone has a good solution at this point, but thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and your opinion and understanding of this topic. I'm sure it is very interesting for our readers and audience to find out that the gap track tool that you mentioned has the potential to support GST in a way in assessing adequacy and effectiveness under GST. And thanks for that. And okay, so let's looking forward. So it is clear, so based on our discussion, that we need to first to build a common understanding of the two concepts under GST, and then based on that to design a feasible approach to assess them. Let me open the floor to all our panelists here to share the insight on this discussion. That what do they say are the major opportunity in the first GST, or what would they think are the next steps that are both feasible and practical? So you are very welcome to reflect those questions based on the perspectives of your connection to the GST. I open the floor to you now. Welcome. Or maybe we can let me just invite Corinna to start.
Thanks a lot, Jing. So yeah, I'm actually surprised by the level of convergence on this panel. Nice to see. And I think, I don't need to repeat that there is obviously no silver bullet, no single approach to this. Maybe in the very beginning, there was this expectation that there could be the one and only perfect methodology on how to review adequacy and effectiveness. But over the time now, I think it has become obvious that there is not. And actually, this is also not the essence of negotiations. The essence of negotiations, at least under the UNFCCC, are to bring to the table different views and different perspectives and also different national interests. And by nature, it will not be possible to find a perfect solution on many aspects. And this is true for adequacy and effectiveness also. And as we have heard, there are also political interests in these concepts and in the expected outcome from the review. So negotiations always are about finding a compromised solution that hopefully meets as many perspectives and as many interests as possible. And so this will be true for this undertaking as well. And so, as we have heard from many of the panelists, that I think the value add already of the GST has been to bring all these different perspectives and likely approaches to the table, and also to reflect on the challenges around and on the gaps that still exist in terms of methodology, but also in terms of data and information. And as I think Susanna has already proposed for maybe the first the outcome of the first GST, if we really manage to structure all these different views and perspectives that have been brought to the table in a meaningful way, and identify the existing gaps and further needs, and then send off parties and other stakeholders and organizations to do further work. I think that would already be a great value add of the first GST. And then maybe in going forward, there could be a more structured approach, and maybe more specifically on the two concepts. In my personal view, I think on adequacy of adaptation, what would be great in the future if under the convention it could be identified whether the established processes and institutional arrangements for adaptation, whether these are actually sufficient to enable practically each and every one to undertake adaptation, from individuals over the private sector, organizations, governments at different levels, whether all of these are enabled by the processes and arrangements that have been set up to undertake adaptation. And here I'm not only talking about finance, but also about, for example, providing information and data in a way that is useful and understandable by all the different stakeholders. Can they actually act on the provided data and information? So this would be a useful exercise, or whether there needs to be more to be done under the convention to enable this. And in terms of effectiveness, yes, that is very context specific, and therefore we need to have this constant dialogue and this constant bringing to the table the different experiences and learnings. And the GST is practically, this very good platform to do that. And here, if we can be a little bit more structured also in the future, to see, okay, how can we best enable this constant dialogue on experiences and on outcomes and on learnings? Where can we close some gaps in the reporting systems, in the monitoring and evaluation systems at the different levels? How can we enable countries at different levels to provide the information that is needed in order to enable others to learn from that information? So maybe there are gaps in supporting countries in establishing these systems, or to make finance flows even more transparent. So I think there are different things that can be identified, and this would be a very useful exercise also for the GST, which would then subsequently enable more action, and then the ratcheting up of action and support and learning in the future. So I think that would be a very useful and practical way forward. Thank you, Jingjing.
Thanks. If it's okay, Jingjing, shall I just jump in?
Yes, please.
Great. So I think, I'm very much in agreement with Corinna and Alex that maybe the main opportunity here from that kind of technical perspective of where we might go with the knowledge is that mapping, the understanding of the framings, of the gaps, that the forms of knowledge. So I think they've explained that very nicely. So I wanted to just bring another point that I feel is one of the other major opportunities is thinking about how we might connect the consideration of outputs phase, how that might really land with different audiences to actually have the impact. So I think that we really see a bit of a democratic accountability gap around adaptation, that it's difficult for groups within countries or across countries to know actually how well their adaptation is progressing, how citizens might engage in kind of pushing and pressuring for different responses, because we often see a kind of more post hoc, disaster. The context is very difficult for a kind of citizenry to engage more actively. And what does a good adaptive response look like? for different countries. So in a kind of more blue sky thinking way, in my paper, I was wondering what is the opportunity here to link with, other aspects of the convention, for example, something like the action on climate empowerment agenda, thinking about on the processes around building awareness and empowering communities. How can we also empower different groups with the knowledge from this stocktake, so that this kind of is a part of a broader kind of global accountability mechanism? And that might not be the right place, but I feel there's some questions there around what's the opportunity to use this further for kind of engage groups in how well those adaptive responses are happening, because increasingly it's going to be a matter that's also going to need kind of public will and public kind of pressure to push for the kind of ambitious responses that we need. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah. May I?
Yes, please.
Just to add to what Susanna said, what we also did was talk to 2 countries in West Africa, and we realized that the process in which these documents do get made are also very politically driven, or there are finance and time constraints. Like one of the countries did mention that they had to kind of complete the document and submit by the time Glasgow happened. So those kind of politically motivations. So that also leads to a lot of non-capture of data, and a lot of action that is actually happening at grassroots do not get so visibly informed in these documents. And for UNFCCC, if these documents are the only way to assess, then the GST could actually take cognizance of such things and kind of propose a way forward as to maybe set a frequency at which these documents need to be updated, and if they could be allowed a little more of time leeway or something like that could probably help bring in more of what's happening actually in those countries.
Thank you, Vidi. I guess maybe Emily, you have something to add for this MEL system's role in terms, just to responding to the point that Vidi just mentioned.
Yeah, actually, I was looking at my notes, and I think just to echo, there's a lot of convergence, and it's great to hear this. I don't have much to add just now, just to say that what seems like a feasible solution and next step for this first GST is working on compiling an evidence base of adequacy and effectiveness assessments and data source from different national mail system, and not just kind of the reporting exercises and vehicles that have been done. As Vidi mentioned, sometimes they are done under quite a lot of pressure, but there's a common view that countries have no data, and that the problem is always to get more data. And now data is never perfect. Nothing is ever perfect, but it's quite a misleading. It's misleading to think there is nothing out there when you look at the information that's included in the different ministries. So, there can be much more than just looking at reporting vehicles. Now, how we do that, there's, to me, or to us, what we propose that there needs to be better training of mail systems, so that to get this more, to understand the weaknesses and to build where the analytical, not just necessarily the data gaps, or the analytical and reporting communications gap, rather than just methodological gaps. I definitely agree with, so I'm not going to repeat what Karina has mentioned. I think I definitely agree with this. And in terms of being pragmatic in how we feedback and how we do, I think that it's really important to focus on these dialogues of what's going to happen after the GST, if we really want to make sure that there is an enhancement of adaptation action, and there is the knowledge being put back in the hands of the actors that need it most. And UNFCCC can suggest probably a way forward. I'll be a bit skeptical and propose that, sometimes it also takes quite a long time to get an agreed decision with the UNFCCC. So actually, I'd encourage all other actors, countries, but also the civil society, academia, to really support countries and the UNFCCC in making sure that this happens, and making sure that continuing the dialogues and getting the evidence back to local actors is happening. So there is a role for everybody to play.
Thank you, Emily. I mean, talking about the future, so one thing we just mentioned here. So, what is the next step? Let's just take the lens of science, how science works. Alex, I would like to hear your insight here. So, what is your insight on how GGA could be potentially conceptualized? For example, just take the example of your gap track tool.
Well, conceptualize, I'm not sure, but what I know, working on these kind of issues for some time now, is that actually we have a lot of information at different levels, and I'm always surprised. This is not what has been said here, of course, but I'm always surprised to hear here and there that we still miss information and so on. I think we have a lot, at least largely enough to take good decisions. So this is the first point. And what we see in the different chapters and in this discussion is that we also have a lot of methods. So we have a lot of information, we have a lot of methods. So to me, the GST is really an opportunity to really try to get a more comprehensive picture of adaptation. But this is an opportunity. But if we miss this opportunity, I mean, it will turn as something that is a failure, actually, to me, because we don't have so much opportunities of this at the global level. So we have the info, we have the methods. Well, to me, of course. So we understand that there are huge convergences between the different things. Of course, we need to fine tune how to organize the different thinkings and methods. Yes, but I mean, human creativity is big enough to solve this kind of problem, I think. But one question to me before trying to aggregate the different types of information, and this is something that the GST could try to put on the table. I don't think that the GST1 will solve the problem of how to aggregate all the information. I mean, let's be realistic, at least, again, from an outsider perspective. But one thing that could be discussed and clarified during the first GST is what is exactly the level of information we need. I mean, do we need only a global perspective? Do we need more disaggregated information? On which kind of dimensions of adaptation do we need information? Is it only things related to finance, or do we also need information on societal awareness or this kind of thing? And to me, this is still unclear what kind of information we exactly need to help the process to move forward. But I don't know so much the process itself, so maybe I'm wrong, of course. But if we clarify by the end of this year the type and level of information we really need, and if we find a way to agree on, okay, let's try to map and see how to aggregate different information, I mean, that would be, to me, a success. I can talk about that more, but we have limited time.
Thank you very much, Alex. And Corina, I see you have a hand. Just let you know we have limited time. Please be brief. Go ahead.
Yeah, a very, very quick comment. One on the reporting. I think the GST could potentially also provide some ideas here, and I think I have heard some ideas in previous discussions on how reporting could be improved in order not to overburden countries. So maybe some innovative ways, also using more digital tools that could be helpful, and also in terms of regional cooperation, using the information that is already there. So as Alex and also Emily have said, that there is a lot of information out there, and maybe we just need to find ways on best to have access to this information. And then one additional comment that might be interesting in this context, that the Adaptation Committee will be launching a new product this year, which is a global, a new information series, so to say, on the global state of adaptation. And this will be composed of two components. One is actually an online tool, which will be composed of country profiles of each and every country, actually, and it will compile information on where countries are at in terms of adaptation along the adaptation cycle, covering the different elements of the adaptation cycle and basically summarizing where countries are at based on submitted national information. And then it will launch or publish periodic publications which will summarize this information, and then also be complemented by information from other sources that can inform on adaptation progress. For example, the first one will focus on how the different UN organizations and their support have already contributed to progress in adaptation. So it will always have this perspective on what countries are doing, and then be complemented with information from other sources. So hopefully this will then also help the process of reviewing adequacy and effectiveness over time. Thank you.
Thank you all for sharing your insight. I think for the interest of time, let's move to the Q&A part of the event, because we do have received quite some good, interesting questions here. We have like 30 minutes left. Let's look at the questions we got here. I think I would like to start with this question, actually related to the very last discussion we have. A question from Marco Silva. The question is, would you please elaborate on who is in fact to benefit from the adequacy and effectiveness of CCA, and how that thinking may guide the design of adequacy and effectiveness frameworks? This question is directed to all the members. I believe the CCA should be, I'm not sure what do you mean by CCA, but let's open this to our panel. Please, Susanna, you can say something about this.
Sure, yes, I think CCA, climate change adaptation, another acronym to add to the list.
Sure.
So I think who should, in terms of who should benefit from the adequacy and effectiveness, I think that's kind of one of the key questions that the stocktake is grappling with, because it depends who defines it, who therefore is benefiting from the adequacy and effectiveness. I think that's really links to the points that many panelists have been making today about how it's important to use the multiple knowledges and multiple kind of understandings of effectiveness, so we can actually capture adequacy and effectiveness for very different groups. And something we haven't talked about so much in the discussion today is also about how do we capture the adequacy and effectiveness for groups who might not be fully covered within a kind of national framing or profile. And I haven't seen all the submissions for the stocktake, but it'd be really interesting to pull out, say, adequacy and effectiveness for groups who might be significant across multiple countries, but within one particular national context, might not have their views and understandings heard. So my feeling is it's very much about being very clear about adequacy and effectiveness for who, and making that very explicit part of the mapping of this first stocktake to identify any gaps. But perhaps others have a different view.
Thank you, Susanna. I don't know whether, Emily, you want to add anything to this question?
I have a similar view, and it's also a question that's come in discussions on the global goal and adaptation as to who. Whenever you have these multiple scales, these multiple actors, you have multiple audiences. So should you focus the perspective of, should we focus on having a great global assessment, or should we focus on bringing down and devolving the evidence to local actors? There will be different views about that. I'm of the perspective that with the aim, if you want to enhance adaptation action, and we don't have the choice. It's a matter of life and death. It's a matter of survival for a lot of people in the world. So the focus should be in improving decisions that are of a daily matter of adaptation and avoid loss and damage. So to me, having a great political or communication at the global level is okay, but it's rare that the global efforts have moved fast enough to avoid impacts that are damaging the life of people every day. So my perspective is that it should flow through the national mail system, but also other systems, because as Susanna mentioned, national and devolved mail systems don't cover all the groups. They're not perfect. So we need also other actors to help bring that evidence down and inform the planning and the decision-making processes. So that would be my take.
Thank you, Emily. And we have the next question. I might want to invite you, Vidi, to say something based on your discussion paper. So here's a question from MB Cheo. I'm not sure I'm correct with your name. Sorry. So this question is: was it possible to identify the needs and the gaps for capacity building in conducting such assessment? I think without being on the same level in terms of capacity development, we would always have these different perspectives. I think this refers to the country reporting, so on. Maybe Wendy, you can say something based on your experience from the MPs and the adaptation communication. What kind of capacity challenge do we see, and how would they be overcome? Please, Wendy.
Yeah, sure, thanks. So when you look at those documents, some of these documents actually acknowledge the fact that there is gap in capacity or there is gap in finance or technology, but not everyone is actually putting it up front. So for example, one of the country cases that country representatives that we talked to mentioned that because it was our first AdCom that we needed to be prepared, we looked at all the submissions that had already come in and kind of modeled our and structured our work there. But if those documents itself, whom you consider as baseline, are missing on certain elements, then that gets reflected here. So I do see that as one of the challenges or capacity gaps, wherein you're kind of benchmarking your work against what's already being submitted versus what you think should have been there given the guidelines on what the outcome should already have. So those kind of things do give an indication of where there are capacity gaps. They also do mention that these capacity gaps would further feed into finance gaps because there is a lack of understanding of how to approach some of the financial options available for adaptation and building resilience, etc. So those kind of things also did come out when we had these discussions with these country representatives, as well as when we started looking at these documents.
Thank you, Wendy.
Maybe just to add on that, I think this question of the burden is quite important, of course, but I think this is precisely where we need the combination of different options, because that means the share of the burden in terms of collecting and assessing. So there is a real added value there. And I personally think that this is also why we need some external views and not only the ones from the countries. But then the question, such as, for example, the gap track or this kind of thing, but others are developing other tools. But the key question then is, will the countries and will the parties accept external views? And when we aggregate at the global level, well, no problem. But when we start to look at, what does it mean at the regional level and possibly at the country level? I mean, the question under the UNFCCC process is to what extent are external views welcome or not?
Can I add here just and answer? And Alex, I think I agree. I think it depends how the assessment is built. So, for example, for gap track, if amongst a variety of experts from the beginning there's an engagement with national and local governments, maybe there's some to make sure there are some representatives from the country, not just external experts. Because that also can be quite biased in a way of kind of the lived experience in the country and understanding of the policy, etc. So I think if you have an engagement with the actors from the beginning and you have the buy-in, then you have a really high chance of being able to contribute, and that it will be very welcome because you're doing it with the countries, yet there is still a way that it's kind of an external evaluation and that you have an impartiality in terms of the assessment. So I think engagement is the key in making sure that it is being included in the systems and in decisions.
Okay, then we have the last question from Let me check the name. From Christina or Betty, the real. I'm sorry with all those names. I think I would like to invite you, Corinna, to say something about this point. So can you elaborate on the negative aspect of political pressures or incentives related to reporting, and how this can be mitigated or at least made more explicit? I mean, it's a difficult question, but please share your insight with us.
Sure. Well, I think I briefly touched on that point previously, that I do see maybe the opportunity also through the GST to discuss approaches and ways how the reporting burden can be lifted in some way. And I think that a lot of people, when discussing the review of adequacy and effectiveness, have also pointed to the requirement of linking different ongoing global processes. So, for example, if we look at the global goal on adaptation, which might come up with some further elements or themes to look at when reviewing progress towards it, and how then the reporting on that needs to be linked to progress made also under the SDG and other processes. So I think that is one thing that is very high on the agenda, I think, for many people, to combine the reporting on different processes. And then, as I said, there might be opportunities today, and also using more digitalized formats of reporting, and maybe providing guidance to countries to maybe report on less, but in a more meaningful way on aspects that are really important for this kind of questions. And maybe through regional cooperation, so that not each and every country needs to come up with data on specific things, but maybe there could be more regional coherence on certain aspects, or more regional institutions or organizations that could take up some of that work, and to really come up with data that is produced in a more digital and format, so that it's not a requirement for each and every country to go and assess certain things and come up with the data and do interviews or certain things, but that it's a more automatic way of coming up with that data, and that could be helpful in a way. Thanks, Jingjing.
Thank you. Let's hope that this can easier the way for the future for country reporting and for GST to collect necessary data. Okay, we still have quite a lot of questions behind the scene. However, we don't have time to address that. I think that's all the time we got today. And I'd like to thank you authors and sitting together with us as the panelists to share your insight with us. I would also like to thank Climate Works Foundation and the iGST program for their support of this work, of course. Also want to use this chance also to thank our individual external reviewers for their comments and suggestions, that we have received very good input from you. And lastly, I also want to thank you all, our audience, for your engagement. So this webinar has been recorded, and we will shortly share the record link on our project homepage. Thanks also go to my colleague Aris and Tripti, who are sitting together with me for their technical support. I think that's all for today. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.